I hope people are seeing this. But again, the first slide is up for a while anyway. So um, in general, yeah, I want to talk about connections, visualizing connections in terms of data visualization. And I guess that you've heard the saying that everything is connected at some point in your life. And although I don't want to debate whether or not everything is connected, I have noticed that connections can be found everywhere. They are really a part of us, of the world, from connections between people, between cultures, within language and nature itself, some being little connections, while others connect us across time, and yet others only exist through the meaning we as humans give them. And in these days when more data is being collected every day than we could ever hope to explore, the variety in connections being gathered is opening up the possibilities to visualize more of these complex systems. And I've been focused on data visualization for a few years now, and I like to take on the bigger data sets, those that have a lot of diversity, so I can show context and other stories besides the main insight. And ever since starting freelancing in 2017, expanding the range of data sets that I get to work with, I started noticing that a lot of my projects can be seen as visualizing connections. Some being very obvious, while others are more subtle, and then some end up as actual sort of network visualizations, while others use a different visual form to best display the insights. And I'd like to take you along on a journey through the design process of several of my favorite connected projects to kind of revealing the ugly truth that goes into creating these big and elaborate, database-driven and often interactive visuals and stories. So I want to start out with straightforward connections, looking at connections that only live in our collective imagination, literal lines that are being drawn, and only through those lines do the connections exist, constellations. So being officially an astronomer, I have to admit that I have a really big bias for all things space. I am often very much inspired by having seen images taken from outer space for my design elements and my visual. And I also find myself making a visualization about space every now and then. And for my final addition to a year-long collaboration that that was basically 12 projects, one project each month. But the last one that I had to tackle had to be about myths and legends. And I did this collaboration together with Shirley Wu, who is also a database freelancer. And I was really stuck on the idea of myths and legends. And through a really sort of winding process, did I eventually end up with the thought of, well, what about myths in the night sky? Sure, I can pinpoint some of my favorite constellations, but those are all from Western culture. And I suddenly thought, well, what about other cultures across time and space? What have they seen in the same stars? Are there certain shapes that almost every culture has identified something with? So I drew a very simple sketch, but in my mind, sort of that very simple circle over there would eventually become sort of a sky map that was also heavily, or at least very much, influenced by the things that I liked about these historical sky maps. And full of enthusiasm to get started, I basically crossed my fingers, hoping that diverse cultural constellation information would be available online. And luckily, I quickly stumbled upon Stellarium, which is a great open source and free planetarium software. And with it being open source, I actually could dig into the data behind it, and I found that they have constellation information available for about 28 different cultures, from Western to Chinese to Maori, but also ancient Mayan and Egyptian. After some initial data prep with that data set, it was ready to create my sky maps in the browser. And I first generally look up some examples, and I work with D3.js, which is a JavaScript library that has basically become the standard in data visualization online. So I looked up a few of those examples. I hate starting with empty JavaScript files, but these were actually pretty straightforward. It was not a whole lot of code. So this was one of those extremely few cases where I thought that I had copied over the code from the examples correctly and then implemented it for my data. So everything should work on the first save and reload. But of course, real life happens, and they were all in a line. Looking a little bit better, I saw that I'd missed a tiny data transformation step, and fixing that did make them appear all across the page. But having my confidence deflated, I had no idea if that was correct or just a happy coincidence. So I added two things that would provide context. first a background grid, which seemed to indicate things were going well, and then the lines that I know best myself from Western constellations. Then I immediately saw Orion, which is my favorite constellation. So, phew, these stars were in the correct place. And in essence, this is already a sky map, but a very boring one though. So I started implementing things to make it both based more on reality, such as giving the stars the correct color and glow and adding streaks for the Milky Way background, but also again remembering what I liked from those historic sky maps, which are things such as the inclusion of a line for the ecliptic and the zodiac signs, and just generally clipping it to a circle and other embellishments that have no true function. So I'll skip that part because it basically comes down to setting up the grid area. But this is how that visualization looked, sort of the sky map looked after I was done. And how my sky map would be different from a general one would be that it had a lot of constellations from many different cultures in there at once. And the way I thought about it was pretty straightforward. I would focus on one star, and then I would visualize all of the constellations that used that one star. So I started out with drawing these sort of tiny donut charts around all of the stars that were used in all of these constellations combined, because often many stars are used by many cultures. So making them the right color, where each color represented a certain culture, and then I wanted to sort of connect these stars with a line, one for each culture, and then side by side. And I first, generally what I do with these sort of more mathematical questions is draw out what I want and then try and sort of deconstruct it in terms of its math. And I started doing it based on trigonometry, but after some things and failing, I figured out that it's actually pretty straightforward using some basic vector math. So normal vectors for the win, yay. So actually that's how the parallel lines came about, quite fast, some bugs to fix once I had it in my code, but that's how these lines came up quite fast. And here you can see sort of the final result for all of the stars that use all of the constellations that use the star Betelgeuse. And when I first saw this, I thought it was so cool to see that so many cultures were using sort of the same shape of this rectangle tightened by a belt. But of course, every culture sees something different in that, from objects to kings and queens and mythical heroes or animals to completely just random things. But I also like to see that some cultures just completely defy convention and do their own thing and make it into something better, such as I really love this one from the Navajo, this sort of man with a boomerang, I don't quite know, or this sort of person from the Egyptian culture. And the brightest star in our night sky series actually isn't used in a lot of constellations at all. So brightness doesn't say everything. It really has to be about a group of stars. I also came across this super cute sort of deer-like constellation that's supposedly in the southern hemisphere that I still want to find once I cross to the other side of the Earth again. I hope that does happen before, old age. And what seems to be the shape that is most common through all of the cultures that I had is the one that most of us know as the Big Dipper, which is used by some cultures even more than once. But here's sort of the full article where I go into many more stars and into deeper into this data set to really try and sort of reveal how to convey how cultures have seen connections in the night sky. But I think when most people think about connections, they think about family ties. How you are connected to your parents, your partner, and your kids, your grandparents, and so on. And for another project in that data sketches collaboration, the topic was presidents and royalty. And I've always been intrigued by how intermarriage the royals really are. Are they all cousins twice removed, or is it farther than that? And I wasn't just looking for sort of the family tree of one royal house going back a few generations, so I could make something more normal like this. No, I wanted as many connections as possible, going back hundreds of years, and then crossing royal houses. Well, thankfully, after some Googling, I found a giant family tree of 3,000 people connected to European royal houses, going back more than a millennia on this amazing looking website. It's right here. It was from 1992, so I did have to spend some hours on Wikipedia adding a few more generations to the main line of succession, also looking up some other famous royals in the meantime. But the problem that I generally have with these sort of heavily interconnected networks is that it's just very hard to draw out anything less abstract than circles connected by a line. And that's because the best shape or way to visualize complex networks is so inherent to the connections within the network. So what I have to do is basically just plop all of the data that I have on the screen, starting out with very basic settings for the network algorithm, and then just see how it goes from there and continue to design with code in a way, which is also what I did here. I just plopped these 3,000 people on the page, and then they just kind of exploded. Like this. They all wanted to have more space. So I thought, well, I'll put in a little bit more gravity to make things more tied up. But then it was like a tipping point, and it became a useless hairball. Coloring it by year of birth, everybody, wasn't really helping. But thankfully, in a browser, you can play with the laws of nature. So I adjusted the gravity in a way so that they would be pulled apart by year of birth. And this was definitely better than what I had before, but it was still a rather uninsightful bundle. And at this point, I had already invested quite some time into playing with the network settings and trying different kinds of connections and adjusting my data. And I was really ready to just give up and try a different angle. But I gave it one last try. And that's when I decided to focus on the current royal leaders. So I placed these in a line, and then I let the vertical gravity depend on which of these royal leaders you were most closely related to. And that's when I finally saw it. Insights. For example, that the Queen of Denmark is over here, and the Queen of England and the King of Norway are quite heavily interconnected, but that the Prince of Monaco line separated from Europe more than 200 years ago. And only once I finally got a handle on the visual form that I wanted to put my data into did I really worry about the visual design aspect. And networks often remind me of constellations, so that's basically the only reason why I turned it into a starry night. So here is the final visual, rotated 90 degrees from what you just saw. And every person here is again connected to their parents, their children, and their partner. And because I wanted to visualize connections between these, I added two types of interactivities. First, we can hover over any person and then see how far 6 degrees of separation reaches into the web. So this lovely lady is connected to 6 current royal leaders, which I'd say is quite a lot within 6 generations. But we can also click on any person, like the Queen of England, and any other person, like Sissy, and see their shortest path. So these two are perhaps not very closely related, although I still think it's closer than many people in the world. But if we look at the Queen of England and the King of Norway, they are basically family. So yeah, I guess this sort of whole exercise taught me that, all right, the entirety of European royal families is interconnected in some way, but maybe not as closely anymore as I thought. But 200 years ago, it was a different story. So I was connected to the Guardian US by a mutual friend, and through the Gates Foundation, they have an entire news section on their website that focuses on homelessness in America. And for their flagship piece about how homeless people were being bussed around the country with one-way tickets, they were looking for outside help. They've been requesting data about the bus tickets from cities and shelters for a year, and they were looking for someone that would bring the insights to life through data visualization. And because I knew that this was too big for me alone, I asked Shirley Wu from the Data Sketches collaboration to become my partner on the project. But with my data science background, I took the data analysis part on me. And each of these cities and shelters had sent over PDF files and Excel files with all of the bus tickets that they'd given out one ways. And all of these were completely different, of course. So that was one thing. But the truly bad part came in the shape of typos and state errors. Because to properly know where the homeless people were going to, I needed an existing city for each destination. So comparing against an official data set of US cities, I created a collection of fuzzy text matching techniques that would try and figure out the actual city in case where an exact match wasn't found. I made sure to manually check each of these automated corrections and change things back if it hadn't gone right. But I also spent quite a lot of time on Google just manually trying to find the actual city in cases where even the fuzzy matching wasn't able to figure it out. And that's how I've come to realize that the US should never have created 4 states that start with the letters MI. That would have saved me some hours. So once I cleaned all of the data, resulting in almost 35,000 journeys, the analysis part began. So what did all of these trips tell us? I created tons of simple plots trying to look for trends and patterns. What about age and gender? What about big versus small cities? What destination was most popular? But what if you try to account for distance? And just merely visualizing all of these journeys happening was an important part. I knew that from the start, but just plotting them as lines on a map was creating one big mess. So I knew it had to be a different visual form. Well, partly due to lucky timing, everybody involved could be in the same room together for 2 days, during which we figured out the main story that we wanted to tell, and we also created designs for the data visualizations that we wanted to make that would support the different conclusions throughout the article. So Shirley and me divided up sort of the visuals that we wanted to make, and my main one would be that sort of map of the US showing all of these journeys. And already during these meetings, I had figured out that instead of all of these lines, I wanted to animate them, make them into little streamlets moving from start to finish over time. And then as time went on, sort of these circles would appear behind the cities to show how many of the homeless people had gone there in that time. So back home, I started to program it, just starting out with a really simple map of the US and having all of the circles move along the same sort of time span. And then I refreshed, and I was kind of surprised to see like these small US sizes going into the bigger US shape. Giving everything the same speed also created these shock waves, which was weird. But just making sure that the people, like the homeless people, were leaving their place at the right time along sort of the time frame already made it look a lot better, thankfully. And then I actually spent a lot of time trying to do different things with this animation to make it more than just these lines moving, such as being able to follow a specific person for a little while. But eventually we just made the animation just the main thing, because that was already sort of impactful enough. Let's see. I'll probably need to move to a different slide because they don't allow iframing. So here's the article, and here we already have that map. What's happening here is actually something that's called scrollytelling. Yes, scrollytelling, where the chart stays in place as you scroll down, and it has different states. So it depends on how far you scroll down to kind of make the visualization change, so that what's shown in the text and what's shown in the chart is in sync. So we're coming up on the animation right now. And it's that the final animation is really just showing all of these journeys. It's probably going very slowly right now because all of these things on my screen. This is generally going faster and probably smoother than what you're seeing. But anyway, the main point of this animation was to really convey this essence of all of these people moving across the US, and that they are going to places all across the US. But there are so many more visualizations in this article, as well as videos and photos and interviews, to really try and find a balance between the personal stories and the high-level insight that this very rich dataset gave us. If you want to read this article, just Google for "bust out," and I'm sure you'll be able to find it. So the next project looks at connections from the angle of the many different cultures that we have on Earth. So since 2003, UNESCO has been gathering and safeguarding an ever-growing list of intangible cultural heritage, which can be anything from practices, knowledge, and skills, and more that people recognize as being part of their cultural heritage. And for the past few years, about 40 new cultural elements, are added each year, and the total list is about 550 at this time, I think. So you can browse this entire list in this not so very inviting table on the UNESCO website. And if you click any of the cultural elements, you get a lot more information as well as videos and photos. But there's something else here in the lower left that's called concepts. So experts of all of these cultural elements have extensively tagged each of them. And notice how they're actually primary and secondary concepts, which will become important later on. So if you sort of compare many of these cultural elements and their concepts, it's probably no surprise that many of them have similarities. They have the same concept, like vocal music being part of all of these except for one. And one man within UNESCO had this sort of vision where people would truly be able to explore these similarities, to see how cultural elements could be the same, even if they were from completely different cultures and countries, even, but just by looking at these shared concepts. And thankfully, he had convinced management to give him some funding to actually make this a reality. And he hired someone for the back end, and he reached out to me for the visualization side. And he was very upfront in his first email about the scope of this network. At that time, there were about 450 elements, some countries and regions, World Heritage Sites, projects, NGOs, and about 1,000 different concepts, which combined are about 2,000 nodes, where nodes is more of the technical term of sort of an entity in a network. And these 2,000 nodes had 12,000 connections between them. And I have to admit, I wasn't really sure if I was ever going to be able to untangle that mess. I mean, with the royalty project only having 4,500 connections, and that already proves such a difficulty to tame. But I did not want to have to say no to UNESCO, so I basically just crossed my fingers, hoping that it would all work out in the end. And with the royalty project, I completely skipped any kind of design sketching phase and just plotted all of my data on the screen because I knew there wasn't really anything else I could do until I figured out the shape. And as I also completely expected, I ended up with hairballs. These kind of infectious disease looking like things kept appearing on my screen no matter what I tried. But there was one aspect of the data that saved me, and that was because that was the fact that not all of these connections were of equal importance. Remember that sort of fancy table where we had the concept? Well, like the tango, it has primary concepts of dance, instrumental music, and vocal music, but it has a lot more secondary ones, such as choreography and emotion. And although UNESCO did not want to aggregate any kind of connections away, they were okay with me only using the primary concepts, the primary connections, to place the cultural elements on the page. So I temporarily filtered anything out that wasn't a primary connection to a cultural element. And then when I saw the resulting network, it was a lot more ordered compared to what I had before. So these yellow ones are all of the cultural elements, and these concepts are all very tiny because I didn't want to have space sort of define the visualization. But I was definitely seeing something here, like communities, sort of things grouping together. And I thought communities could be a great way to untangle this web one step further. So in network analysis, you talk about communities when you have groups of nodes that are more heavily connected with each other than they are with the rest of the network. And thankfully, smart people have created ways to calculate these new communities, so I can then use the results from that to color each community differently, which is what I have done here. So then we can see these clear kind of communities. And seeing this and this going in the right direction, I thought, well, okay, so now I'm going to scale all of these concepts by the number of connections that they have. So this one has many connections, so it's going to be really big. So that's sort of the most important concepts are also the biggest circles. But it also helps because it creates sort of a visual diversity, which is more pleasing to the eye in a way. However, in this case, all of these circles are at the start of the network algorithm. They are placed randomly, and then stuff happens, but they can be in each other's way. So then you cannot often you don't have sort of the best end result if you have this many nodes in your network. So what I did was, well, I kind of know where, which groups should be together. So instead of placing them randomly, I placed them in a circle. And now, instead of randomly, I would let the network algorithm sort of start doing its thing. And I was really happy to see that even though, some of these are pulled towards the center in other places because they have more ambiguous connections, but many of them stay really close to the point where they start because everything that they're connected to is really close to them already. So that's what showed me that looking at this particular data set in the form of these communities was a great way to sort of reveal the inherent shape. Well, then it was time to put all of these things that I'd filtered out back in, everything that was a secondary connection, first placing them sort of an average location to everything that was already on the page, then running a second network algorithm that kind of took into account all of the connections again, and kind of moving them a little bit towards the center. And I'd already sort of moved away from this color palette, which was sort of I always like using rainbow color palettes for the start. but I made it a slightly different rainbow color palette than each of these sort of node types, like a region, a country, an element, a concept, became sort of their own kind of shape. And I really liked how, if you zoomed into this visualization, how it reminded me of outer space in a way. And without me saying anything about that, the client at UNESCO started calling this visualization the constellation, which, of course, being an astronomy relation, I had no objection against. So with all of these circles in place, it was time to look at the lines. 12,000 lines. How do you handle that? So, gray and straight lines seem boring, so I made them colored and curved. But 12,000 lines is just never going to work at full opacity. So I had to sort of play around with that, and eventually decided to again look at sort of the importance of the lines. So if you hover over anything, it shows you all of its connections, where the secondary ones are thin and the primary ones are thick. And then if you don't hover over anything, you really only see the primary connections. But that's really, a lot of other things played a role in this particular project, such as the client wanted it to be that if you hovered over a region, it would go down to all of the countries and then show all of the cultural elements connected. You had to be able to send a query to the visualization of many different elements, which all of them would fix themselves in the visualization. And even if you clicked something and it fixed that, you'd still have to be able to hover over any other circle and get information about it. If you'd zoomed in far enough, the circles would have to show photos of the cultural elements, and you'd have to be able to zoom and pan in the first place. And naturally, it had to be some sort of option to show a modal that revealed information about the cultural element. And that's really just the tip of the iceberg, but let me show you sort of the final visualization. So here it is. You come to the page, a little bit of explanation. And what it wants to achieve is let you have fun and exploring. So maybe there's something that you want to start with, like puppetry in Slovakia. And then you can kind of see what it's connected to. It's connected to festivals, costumes, handicraft, Czechia. That makes sense. Like vocal music, we go to vocal music. Well, this one is connected to a lot of things. It's one of the most popular connections. But we can see it's connected to this, which I don't know. But this is, again, connected to scientific publications, so I like that. And that's kind of how you are sort of meant to go through this network and see how in the end everything is connected somehow, and some things are more closely connected than other things. And thankfully, UNESCO was so happy with the end result that they actually postponed the online launch until the yearly convention when new items are being added, which was pretty darn cool. They also got some extra funding so I can make more visualizations about different sort of forms of this visualization. And I really liked how open they were for me to try out different visual forms that weren't standard to kind of reveal the complexities of this and diversity of this data set. All right. Well, perhaps not very obvious, but connections can also be drawn within our language, depending on how you look at sentences and similarities between sentences. So for a while now, Google has been asking data visualizers to create database-driven stories based on Google data. And I've had the fortune to already create one for them. And I was really happy when they reached out to ask me to do a second one. So I thought hard about the topics that I could create a visualization about, but I shared a few with my contact at Google, but there was one that really jumped out at me, and thankfully also with my contact at Google, which was doing something about pets. So having this cute little fluff ball in my house for almost 16 years now, I have found myself on Google every now and then to kind of wonder, look up why she's showing some weird behavior. In general, just why the need to climb into anything box-like. She only wants to lie on the table if the box is on the table. And I was kind of wondering how other people use Google to better understand their pets. So the general idea would be, in terms of data, that I would get the most popular questions that start with the words, why do cats? Or why does my cat? Why does a cat? And the same for dogs and a few more of these variations. And then I would look into sort of what are the big trends, what are the funny things, what are the commonalities, and so on. And I drew a very rough sketch. I don't make pixel perfect sketches. I just draw something and share it with my client. But this was the main idea, where I would kind of break all of the sentences apart and then recombine them to form a sentence tree. Let me explain a little bit better what a sentence tree, what I mean with that. So eventually I got 2,000 of the most popular questions that asks why about cats. And the same for dogs, by the way. But I can say, well, give me everything that has the word like as the first word. So why do cats like? Well, that gives me a smaller list. But even within this, there are actually 3 questions that have the word boxes as the second word. So I can combine that one step further. And if I keep on doing that for all of these sentences, I eventually have a sentence tree. So I can create a sentence by following a line from left to right. So why do cats like the sides of their mouth rubbed, or the smell of metal or chlorine, or have like their back slap, bum patted, butt smack? Strange. Um, there are some strange questions in here, but anyway, this is taking up a lot of space, so I thought I'll shorten all of these lines. I'll make them appear around the main word, the like word, and also I'll scale all of these circles based on how popular they were. So like boxes is very popular, but like shoes is much less popular. But this is just one aspect of the visualization, and I wanted to visualize all 2,000 questions at once if I could. So again, I started out with a very simple network and trying to make these connections sort of visually clear, such as using sort of the distance away from the circle to say like how many words has the sentence grown. But I also really needed to make these circles bigger so I could place as many of the words that the circles represented inside of them. However, that made it very hard to see the connections. They were just these gray blurs moving outward. It wasn't really clear who the parent circle was over here to any of these circles. And that's when I started trying, God, I don't know how many things to hopefully make it clear, such as clustering all of these sort of child circles that belong to the same parent, but then it still wasn't really clear who the parent was. And sometimes I would just get the strangest results, like this one, where all of these circles slowly start rotating faster and faster, and I still don't know why this happened. And it kept randomly happening, and I just undid my code until it stopped happening, and that still didn't really reveal to me why it was happening. Anyway, at some point I thought, well, maybe if I sort of group all of the children's circles of a parent inside another circle, and then I only have one line between the parent and the children's circles. So I drew out some sort of idea in my little notebook. I always draw out ideas beforehand, like bigger ideas. And here I had it working for the first time with code, where you can see like here are all of the children's circles of the word lick. But it was it wasn't really helping, maybe a bit. However, the whole wasn't kind of conveying insights to me, and yeah, things kept on going wrong randomly, just completely, but in a fun way that I needed that. But no matter what I tried with these packed circles, it was it remained an overload of information that I felt would scare people away from actually digging in. And then so I tried other things, yet other things, and other ideas, and this went on for about a week. At least I think. Eventually, I even made it so that, wait, I'll make all of these circles draggable, and then I'll just drag them in exactly the way that I think I want them. So it took me 2 hours to drag all of these circles over here. I took a step back, looked at it, and still felt like it wasn't really inviting people to want to explore. So about 40 hours after starting with that very first simple network, did I throw in the towel and give up finally. But I had to visualize this data somehow. I mean, it was a client project. So I actually looked back on all of the different tests that I did, and I remember thinking there was one test where I basically cut all of the connections to the central cat circle so that each branch would become its own mini tree. We saw like, for example, already, but there's also like lick and need and have and meow. And I really remember thinking of how I quite liked how it looked. Of course, this took some time to get working as well. But how sort of these mini networks, these mini trees looked. So I thought, well, maybe I can just make a visualization with these mini trees. Drew another sketch on the idea of like how I would sort of make sure that these trees would be not bumping into each other. And eventually made something that basically looks at the amount of space that is available on the screen that the user has. It has all of these circles. It calculates how big the circle needs to be to try and fit the entire tree. And then it uses an algorithm to try and reduce the overlap. And once that's settled, I run a separate network simulation within each of these circles, which a few of the bigger ones you can see over here. But it doesn't actually need to be animated. All of this can be done, all of these calculations can be done under the hood. I was using web workers, I lost the word, web workers to do this. So the end result is really just immediately showing you all of these trees. And at this point, I was probably biased after all these hours, I was finally happy. I finally felt that I found a balance between giving people access to the entire data set, because, you know, different people interested in different things, while not being too overwhelming to want to explore. And what made, you know, trying to make it even more fun and enticing people to want to explore, I looked really at the design side, and I made this very whimsical and colorful and sketchy to really try and sort of make people have fun as they sort of move the mouse over all of these trees. You know, why does my cat pee on things on the floor or pee on the bed? I guess they pee everywhere. Why they eat grass and vomit? And one of my favorite ones is about why do cats eat plastic Christmas trees? I'm glad my cat doesn't even eat my real tree. But of course, this wasn't the only visualization on that page, so the entire process started again for other visuals. I tried, I don't know how many fonts and color choices. I had to write the text for the page. I also had to come up with a layout for the entire page. There had to be different kinds of interactions between desktop and mobile, really exploding the underlying complexity. And from a professional perspective, I really don't like that we have smartphones because the screen is so tiny for my data visualizations. But from a personal perspective, I'm of course very happy that we have smartphones. There's also this sort of search box that had to come and that had to interact with that bigger visualization. But let me just show you the final result. So these animations are not done by me, but these are created by Juliana Chen, great animator. We can choose between cats and dogs. And then it kind of goes into first trying to sort of ease you into this data set. You know, why are cats afraid of cucumbers was very popular because of the memes. And then eventually it takes you to this entire data set. Hopefully at that time you won't be sort of frightened by it and want to play with it. But there are even different ways of looking at the same data sets, such as, you know, what are the most popular questions versus normal questions and my cat questions. And of course, cats versus dogs. And then there's the same page for dogs. Also a very fun project, but definitely I think still the biggest project I've ever done. So let's see, I think maybe I can go through this one really quickly before time's up. But for the final example, I want to step away from connections that relate to humans and look at systems instead. So I was approached by Alice, which is a startup from South Africa that uses machine learning to try and find good investment opportunities. And they achieve this by building their own operating system, Alice OS, on which the business runs. And they wanted me to visualize this system. So to quickly explain the data, one too far. Each data point is a service, some task that is being run, something as simple as copying a file to running a machine learning model. And each of these services, these data points, belongs to a different domain, such as all file handling services and all machine learning services. And often all of these services can create other services, and that's where the hierarchy is created. And Alice wanted a visualization that would be used for management purposes, so showing an overall view of the state of the system and revealing task dependencies, you know, what services were failed. But at the same time, it also had to be used for marketing purposes. So it had to look good and also be in line with their branding, which was basically black, white, red, and these long exposure shots, which I thought would be an interesting challenge. So the reason they asked me is because they thought that royalty network was actually could really work with their data set as well, where we have time on one axis and then the network is pulled apart on the horizontal scale by these royal leaders. And they thought, well, we can use the same with time on one axis and the domains could pull the network apart. So I thought that kind of made sense. So let's try that. But when I had it actually working, I saw that it completely didn't work well with Alice's data. Because often when a service created a bunch of other services, this happened within seconds of each other. So all of these circles wanted to basically be in the same blob. And also these domain crossings weren't happening very fast, very often. Tried other things, completely failed. So I reached out to Alice and told them that I really needed to just take a step back and go into a proper design phase to figure out what I wanted to do. And they were okay with that. So for the next few days, I basically drew out something in my little notebook and took a few hours to make it a reality with Alice's data, such as grouping everything by domain and by time in a circle, or using different spokes, one for each of the domains, but that wasn't sustainable in a way. Networks just gave me 7 little hairballs, which I didn't want to touch further. This sort of radial tree was really good at showing the dependencies of one task creating another task creating another task, but it couldn't work because it wasn't constrained by domains. Like a file handling task could create a machine learning task, but the machine learning sort of domain was over here. Anyway, I went back to the spokes. That didn't really work. Things could overlap. I did this, also not working. So I really took a step back and tried to figure out what did I like from the things that I tried. And one thing that I liked was this sort of circle where everything was clearly grouped by domain and then sorted by time, and this radial tree where the dependencies were clearly visible. So I thought, well, maybe I can sort of smoosh those two together. And I created something that I called a depth circle, where things are basically still sorted by domain, but any child service is placed one ring farther outward than a parent service. So basically, these two show the same thing. Each service is at the same angle, but the children here are placed one farther outward from their parent. Thankfully, Alice also liked this idea, so I went about making it a little bit more on brand with using these sort of streaks. Wasn't always working. Streaks and glows and things to make certain things stand out. Also, I had to make it animated, being able to handle updates to the data. Here is the actual interactive version, which you could try on Alice's website. I'm out of time, so I'll just not show this any more than that. But of course, there are. It doesn't just stop with these examples. We can often find connections within, the way a company is organized, or different kinds of connections between people besides family, such as friends and lovers, or connections across time, such as all of the fights that one character of Dragon Ball Z has appeared in. And I hope that these examples have shown you that connections can be amazingly different. And I found that revealing the intricacies within requires a very iterative and creative and especially custom approach. Some networks are so straightforward that you can actually create sort of a design sketch beforehand, but more often than not, they are so elusive and complex that there's really nothing else I can do than just put all of the data on my screen and continue to design with code so I can really see what each of my choices, what the effect is on the network as a whole. If you'd like to explore any of these visualizations that you've just seen, you can find that on my portfolio page and even more connected projects. And thank you very much for your attention.
She may well be just taking a tiny moment breather to get a glass of water or indeed an ice cream on our way to us. Just a reminder that you can put more questions in the Slack channel, or indeed right here in the session chat, so we can spot them. Nadieh, yay!
Yay! Yes.
You navigated from one place to another. It's nice that even though it's an event where you go from one destination to another during the conference, you don't actually have to move. You don't have to do the conference room shuffle. True. So that's nice. Thanks so much for taking us through all of that. It's always a joy to see some of that work. And there were some questions that came up along the way, if you're good to chat for a bit. And one that I think is a great one to kick off with came from Lindsay in the chat. And she was asking what maybe a lot of people are thinking about. So can you share what led you to identify data visualization as the career that you would be interested in? I know you've kind of, obviously you trained as an astronaut and failed at being an astronaut, as Vitaly told us all. But how you found yourself heading down that path, and what were your first steps that kind of took you down the path to becoming someone who is, a freelance data visualization artist?
Yeah. So, looking back, there are more cues to that data visualization was a really good fit for me. But I guess in sort of a conscious way or a career pathway, I graduated as an astronomer, astronomer. But I knew I didn't want to go into academics further because I enjoyed doing the research, but I really hated writing the papers. And I also didn't quite like the idea where I would go into something where maybe two other people in the world might understand what I'm doing. I wanted something a little bit more tangible. So I said goodbye to that and went into business, came across consulting, and especially data science was coming up then. And I really enjoyed that idea of solving puzzles, even though the data wasn't about stars anymore, but about maybe mortgages or what people buy in the supermarket. I thought that was interesting.
Yeah.
So I started working at Deloitte as a consultant, and because we were external and people have to pay a lot for these sort of consultants, we had to make lots and lots of slide decks. Like if we were at a client, we had to make a slide deck every week, and we were expected to work hard and work fast. And if we were analyzing this data, making algorithms and trying to find insights, there were often visualizations in the slides because it's just not fun to put a table in a slide.
Yeah.
And that's how I really got into data visualization more, because as sort of the algorithms that we were doing, that I was doing, were becoming more complex. The best ways to visualize them, I noticed, like after Googling, like how do you do like an association analysis visualization, I came across more complex visualizations and spend time to kind of learn D3, learn JavaScript to be able to learn D3, because I saw that it was really cool to be able to do these interactions. But at that point, I really saw myself as a data scientist, and it wasn't until, and this was in 2014, at the end of 2014, when I went to a conference where somebody said, had on their first slide, they had blah, 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 and then data visualization specialist. And I was like struck by lightning, like, wait, data visualization can be like a thing on its own. Doesn't have to be part of data science. And to me, that was, at that moment, it was like, oh, that's what I want to do. It's where my passion is. It really combines sort of the side that I really enjoy with the math and the being able to work with data and puzzles, and it combines that with the creative side, which I've always also had but wasn't really aware of. But if you look back, there are many cases where I know that that's always something that I was really looking for and really missing in data science only. So from that point on, I really focused on becoming better at data visualization. So all of my free time and evenings were spent on doing, like, reading books to learn best practices, making personal projects to get better, get more experience, get better at programming. And that's how that kind of started. And after a year, I could switch jobs to become a data viz designer at Adyen, where I made dashboards in D3. After a year, I figured out that's also not creative enough. And that's when I decided, well, might as well try this freelancing thing. See how that goes. I can hold on for 3 months, and after that, I need to make a proper choice. But that's when I did that, and it was a good choice, and I've been doing it for 3.5 years now, and never regretted that choice.
Nice. No going back. No going back to making decks of tabular data.
Yes. Oh, it's been so long since I made my last PowerPoint. Wonderful.
I love that you used the term puzzles along the way there, because like seeing a bit of your process there, it feels like a giant puzzle that I think many of us would just think, no, I don't know how to make any sense out of this noise. And so I'm kind of curious about just I mean, you talked a little bit about your process already, but that journey from a massive noise to, there might be, because I guess it's not always the case that there's going to be a coherent story. I mean, do you have to have faith that you'll find a thing, or do you go into that data having an idea of the kind of insights that you're hoping to glean from it, or some expectations?
So in terms of the projects that I get, they really go from the full spectrum. So sometimes, especially when it's more with newspapers and magazines, they already know the conclusion that the visualization needs to show because they've written about it. So it's really just sort of like, we know this data says this, but can you make it clear to us in a visualization? So then I really know, like, very specifically what I'm searching for. I need to make this conclusion clear. And then there are also the other side of the spectrum. There are companies that basically have, we have a lot of data, and we think that maybe making it into a visualization will help either our employees appreciate more that this data can help them, or be more of a marketing tool. Like, look, we have so much data, we know what we're doing, hopefully, and then make it into a visualization. So then it's really up to me to try and figure out what is sort of the interesting thing to show.
Yeah.
And then in those cases, I try and see, like, go and start from it from a very personal perspective. So I have this data set and I see it like this sort of treasure trove that I still need to open the lock to. And I try
Yeah.
all of these different things and different slices and different ways to look at the data, but always thinking at it from like, what do I find interesting about this data? For example, I once had all of the flights of a particular airline for a year. That was about 50,000 flights that they did, and I knew where they had gone to and at what time, what date. So I thought basically just seeing the trends of, what is the flow throughout the day, and that's, the flights from that side of the earth coming in during the morning, and the other ones to the US, they have their certain things, and being able to see when vacation time was happening just by looking at the kinds of flights that were happening, and that's sort of like from my very personal perspective. I try and figure out, well, what questions do I want to sort of have this data set answer me, and that typically leads to some sort of way to visualize the insight, and then discuss it with the client. Like, I found these things. I've also had cases where I found these 4 things. I can make 2 of them for you into a reality. Which 2 do you want?
Right. Along the way there, you kind of talked about like magazines or publications saying, here's some data, can you tell this story with the data? And that relates to a question that I'd kind of written, and then it came in phrased differently. And so the way that it came in phrased differently to how I'd done it was, is it easy for you to spot a chart that tries to trick you? Which is a much more direct way that I was trying to think about. There's different interpretations, but that's the nub of it. I mean, it's a big responsibility, right? The way data is conveyed, and especially these days, it feels like people can take the same bit of data and manipulate it into the shape that tells the story that suits them. Is that something that you have to be kind of actively on your guard for as you're developing it, in case that happens, unconsciously, or how do you kind of safeguard against that? Is that ever a worry?
Yes, that's definitely something I take into account. Especially, also, I once had a client who had a story for a magazine, and not all of the data points were sort of really showing the point that he was going to make. And like, in general it was, but a few were very strong and others were not that strong. And he was like, can we just show like that one, and that one? And I said, no, I can only, like, if you look at the data, I can show you like the top X. If you want to show the top 3, the top 10, I'm okay with that. But I'm not specifically picking out specific data points because they don't match your story very well, because there's no like logical way or sort of objective way to make them like, why they couldn't just be filtered out. That's just the way of the world. Nothing is perfect if humans are involved in terms of how things occur in the natural order.
Yeah.
But when I work on data visualizations just in general, I do definitely try and always sort of do this sort of, if I make choices about the data, they have to be this sort of very abstract things, like I'm ordering by a value, or I'm only taking the top of a value. Of course, there are biases in the fact that how the data was gathered in the first place. Like maybe 10 variables were gathered, but there were many more variables available, like in reality. Or this group of people has been, the data is about this group of people, but maybe there are missing groups from there. So it's always like, there are so many places where biases come in. And I don't have, I mean, if I spot any of those, I definitely tell them to my clients. For example, like, you can't say this about the data because we are missing points of the data. So you cannot say that this is the best because you've not gathered the entirety. You can only say that from this data set, this seems to be the top one, but you can't
So
say
you
that it's
almost
the
find
best.
yourself kind of having to like give almost like legal advice there. It's like you're going to get yourself into kind of legal hot water if you're not careful with how you phrase some of these things.
Yeah, yeah. Although I guess I don't see it from a legal way. Like for me, the like the passion comes more from I wanna do justice to the story in a way, and the visualization. But yeah, so it's definitely something I always keep in the back of my mind, just to be as unbiased as I possibly can, even though knowing
Sure.
that there will be bias.
Yeah, yeah. Just like changing tack a little bit. You've shown quite a variety of visualizations in so many of your talks that I've seen. Do you find that there are particular, I don't know, techniques or like styles of visualization that you keep coming back to time and time and time again? And it's just like, well, this is the thing that I can use for so many different types of data. And do you have one that you just can't quit because you love it so much?
So I wasn't aware of this myself until somebody sort of told me in after a talk. It's like, you do a lot of visualizations in a circle. Like, what is your reasoning for that? And I'm like, do I? I do. And I was totally not aware of that. But I do generally like putting things in a circular form because of the symmetry that it has. But also, if you just bend, I like visualizing lots of data, and if you basically bend a straight line into a circle, it takes up much less space, so you can put a lot more information in the same kind of space, and it's just visually appealing. It doesn't work. Circles don't always work. Like for line charts, bending a line chart in a circle often doesn't work. But for other cases, it's a very visually appealing shape. I also, but other than that, there are not specifically chart types that I go to very often, because I like to sort of think outside of chart types. So I think more in more abstract shapes, like in circles and lines and rectangles, and more in that kind, in line, look like lines of different thickness or circles of different sizes and opacities. But I don't think in scatter plot line chart. I seem to have I don't know when that happened, but it's like one level lower in the more closer to the sort of the abstraction of data visualization, I guess.
But hey, I mean, if you're an artist, then you have this is your circle phase. This is your circle period of your work. That's legitimate. How about observing the work of others? Because I imagine that, you know, like thinking back to when you were kind of getting started and thinking, well, I don't want to put another one of these tables in these decks, so I want to move in this direction. There's probably things that inspired you that you'd seen, and probably still lots of places that you draw inspiration. Do you have any particular favorites that you just kind of, you look at and go, oh, I wish I'd made that, or you draw from in particular?
Yes, oh, definitely, yes. There are so many visualizations that I'm basically jealous of. It's like, oh man, I wish I came up with that. So what I've been doing ever since sort of going into data visualization is I curate Pinterest boards. So I have a bunch of them, each like one on geography, one on circular things, one on infographics, simple things, beautiful things, can be both. And then I every time, so on Twitter or for when competitions, data visualization competitions sort of happen, I go through basically the entire list, and I pin everything that I find interesting. And then when I start on a new project, I kind of first sort of very roughly think about things, but then I go through some of my Pinterest boards, and I make sort of a client mood board separately, like a secret board that I pin everything to that I think might be interesting for many different reasons. And then when I really sit down and sketch up some designs, I look at those, the ones that I picked out, and try and use elements, like different elements from certain ones, and combine them in different ways. So I don't like copycats, but I'm very much a remixer in a way.
Yeah, and I guess it's like, I mean, we were talking with Dan Mole earlier on about kind of designing UI and kind of components that are solving a particular problem. And I guess, you know, there are lots of patterns that have evolved because they're effective in solving a particular problem. I guess that's probably some, I mean, we know there are lots of ways that conventions that we see data, you know, all the time, right? So I guess that those are effective. And I imagine that reaches all the way into the much more exotic ways that, you know, you'll be visualizing data. There are,
Yes.
yeah, definitely seen some patterns there.
Yeah, there are definitely patterns. Like if you want to visualize flows, that's usually done with lines with different thickness, where the thicker the line, the bigger the flow. But there are so many ways that you can actually place the flows on the page. They can just be like boringly run from left to right, or you can make them go off and then kind of go off to the sides, or you can make them go in a circular kind of way. So that's where I guess the sort of the data viz expert or the design side comes into things. Like how can I make from like these basic things that help, like circles for this, lines for that. How can I make that very particular to this data set, these insights,
Mm,
this client's style guide, and make it visually like appealing so people want to see it?
yeah. And how does the medium that you're working with like influence the way that you might tackle it? Because you've talked about, oh well, this is something for maybe print, and now you've also got the ability to have things that are interactive, and so many things that you've shown or animated, and now obviously when in like the world of web development, we kind of think about the canvas being squishy because you never know what people are going to be, how the people are going to be viewing it. How do all of those considerations factor in, or is it very difficult to take those into consideration?
Oh no, it's one of the major things that I try and hash out with the client at the start of the
Mm,
project. I mean, it's a very big influencer on project budget, because the more interaction and things it needs to take into account, the way more time it takes me to do. So that's also a main reason. But I really need to know before I go into a design phase. I need to know, is the end result going to be static, interactive? Does it need to work on mobile or just desktop? Are we going for a video, or is it scrolly telling? So. That's really the main thing, because if it's static, I know that performance is not an issue. I'm only annoying myself because I have to wait 10 seconds every time I save my file for the page to reload. And I can handle that until a certain point. But if it's going to be interactive, it has to work in performance. I know that I cannot do some things.
mm,
And even then, sometimes I have ideas, and then during development, it's like, no, this is not going to work. I need to compromise. But so that's a major factor of what I can do, and especially when it's mobile, I have to sort of downsize again and think about, what is going to work on desktop and mobile, or how can I uh, change it from a like full screen to something that also works on the small screen. So it's very, very important, and it really comes down to the design phase side.
do those kind of, I mean, that sounds incredibly frustrating,
Mm.
thinking about the richness of the data. Do sometimes those constraints create unexpectedly kind of lovely results that you would never have found had they not been a constraint?
Um,
Or does it normally feel like you're having to?
in all honesty, like the performance issues always feel like a constraint, because I have
Yeah.
an idea and I need to make it less like spectacular because of the performance. And also with mobile, I have not yet had a case where I thought, oh, the mobile looks better than the desktop. Oh my God,
Hooray!
I'll just
Hooray!
make it.
Less real estate.
Yeah,
Yay.
no. The only like I do have these sort of it's not a bug, it's a feature kind of things where I have programmed something and it does something wrong, but it's better than what I had in mind to actually want to do. So I keep the wrong code in and make it the final code. But no, performance and mobile is always for me a constraint I don't want to have. So I'm actually doing more static work these days than I did when I started out freelancing. It's just also I try and convince my clients that static is just better than interactive.
Fair. We're kind of coming up to time, but there's a couple of questions I'd just love to finish up with, if I may. So the first one Henri has asked, and it kind of relates to our kind of conversation about you know tricking people with data. And he's asking, have you seen any suspicious data around COVID presented, and do you recall what it was, if so?
I have to admit that I actually, when that happened, I kind of uh, how do you say that? Sort of signed off from the scene for a little bit.
Yeah,
Everybody was doing COVID visualizations,
yeah,
and for me, my clients just dropped away. Everything was on hold, so I bought a pen plotter, and I just basically spent 2 months pen plotting, and mostly ignoring what was happening in the world of data viz. So I have to admit, I haven't seen anything, but it's because
That's
I
that's
haven't
fair.
seen it.
What a healthy answer. Yeah, I must admit I'd seen one or two of those plots, and that looks like lots of fun and
It looks,
definitely a healthy way to
yeah,
to
stay at
spend your
home.
attention.
Yeah.
So that's fair. Okay, and then one last question. Let's finish with this one. And Yarin asks, no, he doesn't. Sorry, Gabby asks, no, if she was to start down this road to try and work doing more data visualization, where does she start? What's the good first step for just putting the toe in the water and getting involved?
Mm, try and figure out what kind of data visualization you like the most. There are people that really enjoy doing dashboards, or with more like Tableau, or working more towards maps. Or do you want to be really creative and work very low level and have all of that power to make things? So I think that's very important, because it's that kind of direction. If you want to do interactive stuff, static stuff, or
Mhm.
dashboards or whatnot, it defines kind of what you should learn and what the best practices in that sort of niche within the niche of data visualization are.
Mm.
And then I would just say create lots and lots of data visualizations about data sets that you have a personal interest in. So don't look at like data.gov. Go to like look up data about your favorite author, your favorite movies, the sport that you're doing, like how is it doing during the Olympics, the world races, whatnot. Try and really get that personal link to the personal projects so that you have the enthusiasm to see it through in a way.
Oh, I love it. What a lovely note to finish on. That I think that's great, making it kind of personal as that first step. Nadieh, thanks so much for spending the time chatting to us, and thanks for a wonderful talk. We're very, very grateful that you're able to join us and do that weird thing of presenting into an eyeless, unblinking glass lens.
Yes.
But we're all very grateful, and it's
Thank
very much appreciated.
Thank you very much. It was really much fun.
Great stuff.